It's ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Ticklish Business, the podcast all about honoring and celebrating classic film. As always, I'm Kristen Lopez, joined by the incomparable Emily Edwards. Emily, how are you?
I'm pretty dandy. I'm so excited for this episode.
This is going to close out our International Month. We started with the 1954 Akira Kurosawa film Seven Samurai. We talked with Alicia Malone about that. And we are going to be closing it out with a look at 1960s Kurosawa, talking about High and Low with the amazing Scott McGee, also of TCM. The TCM peeps, they're family on this show at this point. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Kristen. Emily, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
When I was soliciting people online to be like, who's my Kurosawa experts? I forget who told me, but I was told that Scott McGee is the expert on Kurosawa. True statement? Fact or fiction?
I would counter that with a true Kurosawa fan. I would not say that I'm an expert on the level of, say, a Michael Jack or certainly not a Donald Ritchie, God rest his soul. But yes, I do love Kurosawa and find his cinema to be endlessly fascinating and just it's such an exquisite look at the human condition that Kurosawa's films do. I love talking about him. So I'm happy to share with you whatever I know of High and Low and whatever I appreciated about it.
I mean, the line between expert and fan or just person with an opinion is blurry these days. So, I'm going to call you an expert as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. I'm gonna take your word for it.
Before we get into that, we'd like to remind everybody, if you are not a patron, then you should consider being one. It starts at just $1. You get access to these episodes early. You get all sorts of swag. I just sent over a bunch of books from Casa de Lopez, as well as some great TCM-centric #MakesMaine pins. I don't think I gave Scott one at the festival this year. He did not get to see the Gen Z tribute to Ben Manx hair that I crafted for this year's pin. But those went out to some great patrons. We'd like to always thank some of our amazing patrons, including Allie Moore, Danny, David Floyd, Gates, Mick F, Shawn Goodreau, and Rachel Clark, as well as everybody else that continues to support the show and give us your money. Thank you so much. But consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. So let's get into High and Low. This is a morality tale, kind of. It's also a police procedural, kind of, about a shoe company owner who is told that his son has been kidnapped and that he has to pay an exorbitant ransom, only to find out that the kidnapper took the wrong kid and actually took his chauffeur's son. And the question becomes, is he still willing to pay a ransom for a child that is not his? I'm going to try to keep this as apolitical as I can, but it's a very interesting movie from that perspective.
Make no guarantees for myself.
So, I mean, Scott, for you, what is it about Kurosawa that you appreciate, and what are your initial thoughts about High and Low in general?
High and Low in general is, first of all, it's a bit of a surprise for me that Kurosawa would look at an American potboiler such as the Ed McBain series in terms of source material. I mean, I would expect him to find something far more arty, I guess. But the fact that he could take something that has sort of a lower pedigree of critical engagement, rather the hard-boiled detective, and make it into a morality tale of this kind, I think it's a sign of Kurosawa's genius. And the fact that he wasn't afraid to try new material and new directions in his cinema, especially at this time after he had worked so fruitfully with Toshiro Mifune on so many different films, and having this being a contemporary film that really addresses, as you said, more of a moral questions, is, I think, a bit of a departure for him. I don't think he did morality tales that often. And so having him do it within the confines of this this thriller, I think it's really pretty grand. And I'm really very much looking forward to see what Spike Lee does with it with the remake.
The reviews for that have slowly started to trickle out from Cannes, and a lot of people seem to like it. I'm very fascinated by somebody like Spike Lee taking this and trying to both modernize it, and how faithful is it, and how are we gonna look at the whole thing is just very, very fascinating. And when they said he was gonna remake it, I knew, I'm like, we got to do Kurosawa. We got to talk about High and Low. This was one that I want to say I watched on TCM when they programmed the Kurosawa tribute for Summer Under the Stars. It's such a different type of movie than if you watch something like Seven Samurai or Throne of Blood, or any of those kind of medievalist action films that he does. I talked about in the last episode watching something like I Live in Fear. Apparently I'm a fan of the Kurosawa like weird esoteric films, because I saw a lot of that film in this, in the sense that it's talking about grander themes of like personal choice and how do we make decisions and what gives our life meaning, how do you want to be remembered at the end of all of this. It's a very deep existentialist kind of film, not necessarily like a French existentialist film. It's far more accessible than that. And it's also just different stylistically in the fact that, it does not have Takashi Shimura in it at all, who was usually Kurosawa's, biggest collaborator, worked in, I think, the majority of his films. Not in this at all. It's pretty much Mifune and a bunch of police officers. And I think what I loved rewatching this movie, which I was very happy it was not 3 hours like Seven Samurai was. It's a very, tight 2.5, is that if you're an American viewer watching this and you're watching this story, you would assume that the entirety of the film is the back and forth with him trying to grapple with this choice of whether he's going to pay the money or not. And his wife is trying to convince him to do it. The chauffeur is very much in that whole, subservient element of, I would like you to pay it, but also I do need my job. So if you decide not to, we can talk about that. You get to see the different stratifications of society at this time, whether it's women, whether it's the working class, how he fits. And it's not a spoiler, that plot line is pretty much resolved about an hour into the movie. Maybe even less than that. And the rest of the movie becomes this police procedural, very noir influenced, about trying to find the kidnapper. And I thought that was really ingenious, because if you're an American viewer watching this, you're expecting something, and then the movie completely just upends that and abandons it for a long swath of time.
Yeah, the film it deals a lot with class distinction, which is a very relevant to our times today, when the rich seem to be granted a classification of humanity, of being humans, where
Definitely.
everyone else has to make do with the table scraps. And I think the title, in my opinion, High and Low, is really not just looking at the main character's lofty position high above the city, but also the people down below in the streets, in the crime, the places where everybody has to make a living. Every other person has to live and breathe and die. And those people who are in glass towers, they have the luxury of being able to have decisions made for them. They have the luxury of being able to use money to solve so many of their problems, whereas other people don't have those opportunities. So having the tables turn, and having the rich man's money actually his wealth being used against him, and as a test to his own humanity, to his own morals, is a rich that's a rich tale. And to see an actor of Mifune's talent wrestle with that over the course of the 2.5 hours, or however long it is, I think in a lesser actor and in a lesser filmmaker, I don't think you would be able to sustain that momentum, that pace, that High and Low has. Because there's, the first half of it is a lot of people just sitting around worrying. But yet Kurosawa still uses his, the widescreen format that he's still learning at this point. I think he's still learning how to draw energy and intention out of just a simple three-person structure of blocking of a scene. And this is the same three-person dynamic that he has in so many of his films, where you have one person in the foreground and another person to the right of the frame in the middle ground, and then you've got a person in the back. And you have so many of those interactions in so many of Kurosawa's films, and to see him using that same structure but having a much wider canvas to work is pretty amazing. And just to see him being able to make suspense out of just people talking is really kind of remarkable.
Emily, I know we talked about this, about how some of the criticism that I was reading compares this a lot to the Divine Comedy. And you had a really good kind of breakdown, and we had an interesting discussion about this. I mean, do you see Dante-esque influences here?
I don't. We all know from college that you can make an argument about anything and try to substantiate it with the text, but I don't see as much Dante here as I do something that is significantly more obsessed with modern class. Dante, obviously, if you're talking about the Divine Comedy, we are almost all more familiar with Inferno than we are, Purgatorio and the heaven one, whose Latin name I can't remember. And Paradiso. There we go. My brain remembered. But, for this, it is so much more obsessed with, and in a good way, not obsessed in a bad way, with the sin of wealth and the overwhelming feeling that wealthy people have, that we've seen back then and now, of having no relation. Wealth buys you distance, and, both physical distance and emotional distance from the people around you. And this does such an incredible job of that. Whereas, obviously the different striations of hell in Inferno, they have levels for the wealthy, they have levels for the adulterers, they have, levels for the lustful and things along those lines. But this, I don't feel it's actually as nuanced in if you're going to slice and dice it that thoroughly. So I thought that was an interesting position that critics had taken for this, but I personally just don't see it. I think we have a little bit more, like you were saying, of the existentialist concept of hell as other people. And so you have Gordon all the way at the top, and he's just like, I have had the ability to buy my power, to work my way up, to remove myself from the filth of society, essentially, even though he works in a shoe factory. And so he has had this wonderful ability to put himself on a mountaintop, and it all comes crumbling down. And I think one of the most interesting about it, I'm going to yammer for another minute or so, of just choosing to put this into the lens of a mystery novel. I write mystery novels. A lot of my friends write mystery novels. I'm very heavily into the sort of crime procedural genre and way of looking at narrative. Is just I talk about this a lot with my friend Libby Cudmore, who's written a bunch of really truly excellent PI novels, and the detective is very much analogous to the White Knight. And so he goes off, and he goes off in order to make things right, even though it is not often required of them. And so I really liked putting that lens over. So if you want to make this analogous to a very old piece of literature, I feel like sort of King Arthurian legend, knight's tales, and things along those lines is actually a better way of looking at this, because you have the tortured man in power who has been seated with this responsibility that he has probably not asked for, and all of the men around him who are going to help him lessen or sort of approach the burden that he's been given.
Yeah, I think what's always interesting watching this as a Westerner is the fact that the cops in the second half, it's a collective unit. No one person really stands out, and they all go as a group. And I love that once the ransom and all of that is done, you would assume that the police would just move on with their lives. And they're like, no, the goal now is to find who is doing this and stop them. When they have really no necessarily real obligation to do so because the central crime has been, nobody's died, the child is safe, but it's the principle of the thing. And I think that's what's really amazing to watch this now in 2025 is the fact that the police force in this movie is more like, well, no, it's about, getting the person off the streets and trying to, do good. And even with the whole thing about, whether Gondo is going to pay the ransom or not, they're like, yeah, you should probably do that. Everybody's really not on his side, which is great because I kept thinking about, Scott, you talked about the hard-boiled elements. I mean, this is based on the Evan Hunter, loosely based on the Evan Hunter novel King's Ransom. And I just kept thinking as I was watching this of how somebody like I'm trying to think of a hard-boiled, like a John Huston would have translated this if he had been making this at the time. And I just kept thinking of how you probably would have gotten like a Robert Mitchum who would have been the lead and would have been in every scene, and he would have been with the police trying to do this, or the police would have been inept and he'd have been the lone guy going to find this person. It would have been a far more active performance for the Mifune character after everything had been solved. And yet the movie is content to say, actually, no, just because this guy has money, it doesn't mean he has any ability to do anything else other than to make shoes and make money. And I really appreciated that of saying, this guy has his space and he's not a Superman. If anything, he is incredibly flawed. And here is what the police who are trained using their expertise as a unit to solve the crime.
Seeing Gondo wrestle for the duration of the film with the question of, do you potentially bring yourself to financial ruin for empathy? Do you how far do your morals go to do the right thing? At what point do you stop doing the right thing? And whether or not Gondo answered that for himself is, I guess, up for debate. But it is a fascinating question. Just putting the screws to the wealthy, to the rich, to somebody who is in a self-made bubble, who's unfortunately that bubble has been pierced just by bad luck. Well, it would have been pierced regardless, especially if his own son had been taken instead of the chauffeur's son. Regardless, it was pierced. But in this way, he had some wiggle room because it wasn't his son. And what does he do? And that is a question that I'm really curious to see what Spike Lee does with it and how Denzel Washington's character gets to that point. I'm really curious what they'll do with it.
Yeah, we have an entirely different relationship to the police now than clearly when this movie was made. And I think one of my favorite details that's actually peppered in quite frequently in this is how one of the police officers is so adamant about telling people how much he hates rich people. It's a running joke where he's just like, I grew up poor, so I thought you were going to be a jerk. I met with the owners of the people who leveraged the buyout of the shoe company, and they were all assholes, and they like, I really thought you were going to be terrible, but like, you're kind of okay. And there's a constant reminder to the viewer that Gondo has worked himself up from nothing. He married a wealthy woman whose dowry paid for the business. He worked himself up from nothing. And that's a common refrain amongst people who are incredibly rich, where they're like, well, I actually started out from nothing. It's like, you couldn't have started out with nothing. You married into an incredibly wealthy family and got, inherited money in some capacity. And it's so modern in that understanding of wealth, but it is still very 1960s in that towards the end of the resolution, we do have the but one rich guy is okay, and that's a very sort of difficult thing to sort of sit with now in 2025, but it's also a very different time politically in Japan in the 1960s. They're in the midst of techno-futurism building up after the war. They have a very different perspective of building wealth than we do now.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Seven Samurai, and we talked about this when we did the last episode, it comes out the same year as Godzilla. And the idea of a foreign invader coming in and people having to collectively band together to stop that, it was very post World War II nuclear bomb allegory. And I don't know a whole lot about what Japan's economics were looking like, where they were politically in the 1960s, but it's fascinating to look at how Kurosawa transitions and starts to move into this new decade by emphasizing the fact that, okay, this whole moment in World War II should have unified us as a country. Did it really do that? And as this movie would say, no, it just stratified the different levels of wealth and all of that. And the people that are in Yokohama, are struggling with drugs, they're struggling with inequality, they're working themselves to death. Has anything really been made better by this collective unity that we were supposed to have had? And it's interesting to look at the fact that Kurosawa said he didn't really like Hunter's novel. He thought it wasn't well written, and so he played around a lot with it. And the fact that he creates people so well. He really just has his finger on the button of how to write a character, because we talk a lot in this country about the good rich person, right? If I had all this money, I would give it to the poor and I would be putting it where it should be going. We all talk like this. And this is a movie that pretty much says, yeah, so does everybody until they get money, and then they have this question, because we meet Gondo at this point where he has just spent all his money. He's leveraged his house, all of this stuff to buy the company himself so that he can have control of it. He quite literally doesn't have the money to give to do this. Even if it was his kid, he still would have been screwed over financially. And yet, he starts to kind of waffle about, like, well, it's not my kid. I don't necessarily need to put myself in this position. Even though most people, I think, watching this would say the word is saving a child, period. Like, that should be a yes or no question. And yet, the script is so skillful at emphasizing all of the reasons why, whether wrongly or rightly, his justifications for why he is quibbling about this. There's that scene with his wife where she's talking about, we'll struggle, it's okay. And he's like, actually, you've never struggled in your life. You don't have any concept of what that is, which is very true. I always go back to that concept because I've been working on my edits for my disability book. I always look at the stats that exist, and these are real stats about how high divorce rates go when a person has a terminal illness. And you start to wonder, everybody again says, I will struggle with you if you do the right thing. Yeah, but why are divorce rates up then? You have to look at all of these other factors. And even the kidnapper at the end, eventually, he's a sadistic human being. He does horrible things. And yet, Kurosawa said he didn't want to make the character, you still have empathy for him. That speech at the end where he's talking about, like, yeah, but, you look down on people. What are you doing to help better the situation? You understand this person. And he also is a horrible human being. Like, I love the character dynamics of how Kurosawa plays with personality and morality in a way where you're just kind of like, you know what? This is human, because I kind of like everybody, but I also kind of hate everybody.
And who's to say the kidnapper, if he had the same breaks as Gondo did, who's to say that he wouldn't be successful and be making similar marks on the world in business and whatever he chose to go into? But instead, he's working his way, struggling as a would-be kidnapper in the underworld of Tokyo.
I mean, I'm curious, Scott. I mean, you work with classic film all day, every day, but I can't help but think of how, this is 1963. 1963, you're also getting French New Wave. You're getting all of these really interesting kind of looks at morality and humanity and these deep existentialist things from other countries. And then you look at 1960s cinema, which is, you have Beach Blanket Bingo and you have other. It seems like the US was a bit frothier in their filmmaking at this time that Kurosawa is making this. Am I off base?
Well, I don't know if I would make it a strict 1-to-1, but I will say that in terms of Hollywood product in the 60s, by and large, I don't like it. There are certain films of the Hollywood era that I liked, but most of them are independent films. The films that came out in 1967, To Kill a Mockingbird, but then everything else, you're talking about Lawrence of Arabia and the work of Kurosawa and so many other filmmakers, Fellini and Ingmar Bergman, making their mark throughout the 60s. That's where cinema was really redefining itself and where the excitement was happening. It wasn't really happening within Hollywood. Hollywood was dying at the time. And so I would say that Kurosawa was on the vanguard of these kind of films. I don't think a lot of people in Hollywood were really interested in making these films. They were more interested in recapturing the heyday of the studio era. But they were doing it with old ideas like musicals and such. But again, there are exceptions like Sound of Music, but those are the exceptions that prove the rule, which I'm still not sure what that saying even means. But I think I used it correctly. The other thing I like about Kurosawa's High and Low is his usage of industrial Japan. You see, so many of his films are set in the past. But the handful that are set in contemporary Japan, I think are noteworthy. With Stray Dog rather, you had the film set in immediate post-war Japan, so you had a lot of bombed out buildings, rubble, just ruin everywhere. And then even into The Bad Sleep Well, which was in 1960, you have a similar view of Japanese contemporary society. It's still very, very grimy and very dirty and just not a lot of people. And it's just not very inviting. And it just doesn't seem very hospitable. And with High and Low, you get a lot of the same look, only Japan is even more modernized, I think. You see a lot more of modern Japan, particularly with the railway system and whatnot, in this film, which is different than what you've seen in previous Kurosawa films. But it's not a celebration of Japan's resurgence at this time. I'm not even sure it's necessarily a critique either, but it's I think is ambivalent or ambiguous, I should say, at best. And the other thing I would say about High and Low that I really appreciate is Toshiro Mifune's characterization, his acting. At this time, Kurosawa was using Mifune in a very different way. With the samurai films, he allowed Mifune to go for broke in terms of his acting. But you start to see it in films like Bad Sleep Well, where there's a much more contained and coiled Mifune. But you still see that rage. You still see that simmering angst and action going on underneath in films like Bad Sleep Well, but especially in High and Low. Mifune brings that coiled tension, not only in the screenplay itself, from the screenplay itself and the way the character is written, but also just in the way of kind of referring back to how he had been used in previous Kurosawa films. he's sort of using the expectation or the past as sort of a blueprint or a base of how he brings this new character to life. That coiled tension is still there, but to do it within the confines of this morality play, I think that I think provides a lot of the suspense that you see in the telling of this film.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up To Kill a Mockingbird because I feel like there would be a really great double feature playing this with something like To Kill a Mockingbird because it shows again that East versus West differentiation in 60s filmmaking and storytelling. I mean, while To Kill a Mockingbird is based on Harper Lee's novel, it is still very much a movie about morality and the really maybe some would say rose-colored glasses view of American tenacity and this awareness of doing the right thing. Atticus Finch would have never blinked twice about giving the money, right then and there. Does that make it a fantasy? I don't know, but I think that there's a lot of fun and interplay that comes from looking at how that movie situates the law and order and doing the right thing versus how this one does. I mean, Emily, I know you talked about seeing a lot of Hitchcock in this too.
Yeah, I definitely did. Really quickly before I jump into that, I wanted to point out the fact that like it's not a coincidence that the kidnappers sort of world starts to unravel as the cops chase him to an American GI bar. Like when he's walking through the downtown, all the Japanese women are wearing very Western fashion. They're in like fit and flare circle skirts. They're in like the traditional or like they're in very like even at the beginning, we're talking about the styles of shoes that they're going to be wearing, and they're very, like work pumps. It's very like, oh, the Western sort of like icons of the 1960s. All of that has infiltrated
It's seeping.
into. Yeah, it's seeping into the sort of world where we meet the bad guy, and I just think it's really, really lovely that they catch him, coordinating the buying of extremely toxic heroin while dancing a bunch of sailors, and like they're advertising Mai Tais in English on the mirrors. And it's just like, oh, yeah, I see what you did there. Like, fantastic. I really enjoy that. But, I don't think there's any denying the fact that like there's extremely strong Hitchcock overtones in this, and it's not. And as much as I love Hitch, it's not as cut and dry as him. When we have the final scene where the kidnapper is being sort of questioned while in prison and he's having a breakdown, there's no way not to see Anthony Perkins in that seat. But it's so much, it's almost easy, at the end of Psycho, where we go, oh, he was abused and he was crazy, so he killed everybody. Dumping, like, and we're out. And again, it was brilliant when it was done in 1960 and it caught everybody off guard. But I think giving him so much more to work with at the end of this it's much more subtle than Hitch would ever do in any of his movies.
I think too, to talk about, I know Alicia brought up how much Western filmmakers influenced Kurosawa and how big a fan he was of John Ford and all of that. I think such a fleeting moment in the film that you really, if you're not paying 100% attention to it, you're going to miss it. But I think I always go back to is the giant of it all to pull from another film. The fact that the kidnapper confuses which child to take because he looks like the other little boy. He's wearing the other boy's clothes and they've swapped. And the whole idea of the next generation hopefully being more interrelated and more interconnected. It's a complete like blink and you'll miss it moment, but I love how it kind of evokes that element of the end of Giant, if that makes this whole concept of like we're all going to be blended one day, which we can discuss Giant on another episode and how effective that ending is. But and I think that we talk so much now, especially about the eat the rich mentality. And yet to watch the actor playing his chauffeur throughout this whole movie, who is trying so hard. Scott, you brought up the coiled quality of Mifune's acting, but I also think it's so complemented by the performer playing the chauffeur, because he spends the entire movie just kind of like in the corner trying really hard not to just like shake Mifune and scream and have these moments of like, dude, just pay the money, okay? This is there's even that moment where I wasn't exaggerating, where he's just kind of like, well, if you don't pay it, I'll understand, and you can tell it's a total false front that he's giving. But to watch that character, progress throughout the whole movie, culminating with the eventual reunion with his child, and the movie pretty much, I think, does something really fascinating that we see now in this huge cottage industry that is true crime, which is like, once he's reunited with the son, he disappears. We don't care about the victim at that point. We care only about the perpetrator and the wealthy guy. History is written by the winners. It's also written by the person that has the most money. And I think that all of that just plays so well against the background of the film itself. All of that is to say this movie is just perfect, in my opinion.
I have someone who finds beef with like every movie that I watch, where I'm like, oh, I wish they'd done this. Oh, I wish. No, there, no, zero. Like, I was riveted from start to finish. And that's partially because of how much I love sort of noir and pot boils. And then like, and honestly, like, I don't like true crime that much. I like the fictionalization of things that we experience, but then we heighten it for artistic means. And I appreciate the fact that it's kind of unrealistic that any of this would happen. I didn't necessarily want it to be something that was, taken from the headlines like a Law and Order episode. And I really love how much reality was put into it. I know we discussed very briefly, like when they go down into Yokohama, into the city, and, and it's like all of the cops are sweating buckets. They are miserable. They hate this. They're just like, there's a scene where they're in the police department and they're going over all the information that we have, and they're just mopping sweat off of themselves. And I didn't know that Japan was as hot as it is, like climate wise, until fairly recently. I made it through 30 years of life without knowing that Japan is an incredibly hot environment, because they never show you that in movies. I didn't know it's like living in Florida in the summer, but this movie just doesn't shy away from creating just this wonderful atmosphere that doesn't pick on actual facts of what is happening and it just like chooses the right thing to fictionalize. And I appreciate it. It just absolutely, it's just phenomenal.
What's worth pointing out, and Scott, I don't know if you have anything to add to this. I mean, I was doing a little bit of casual Kurosawa research. He only made 8 more movies after this film. So, to look at that filmography of just, icon, 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 and then it's a very contained, little filmography. And, from what I was reading, the after effects of putting this out, which the movie was, there were a lot of questions, especially in the 1970s, about whether the movie was anti-capitalism, and how did he feel about capitalism in this landscape. But I mean, after the movie came out, JFK gets assassinated. Kurosawa dealt with kidnap attempts on his own daughter after the movie. So I am fascinated to learn more about how just the concept of being Kurosawa had to be exhausting, just to have everybody analyzing every little piece of your movie that you're doing, and having to kind of top yourself as you're working.
Yeah, it's hilarious that people thought it was anti-capitalist. Having a rich man, judge a question of morality, that's anti-capitalism. Sure. I would say that in regards to Kurosawa's later years, the late 60s into the 70s were not an easy one for him. He had a lot of professional setbacks. I know that there was a suicide attempt, I think in the early 70s, I believe. So it was a rough time for him during that era. But yeah, I mean, he bounced back with films like Kagemusha and Ron, both of which, by the way, starred Tatsuya Nakadai, who appears in this film as the inspector, Inspector Takura. And Nakadai, I think, really filled the void that Mifune left after he and Kurosawa parted ways after Redbeard. They had a falling out, unfortunately. But Nakadai, I think, really has stepped in to sort of being that sort of Kurosawa representative, or that go-to guy that Kurosawa went to a lot. Whether or not he was as strong as Mifune, I don't think I could say yes, but I think Nakadai certainly made his own mark, starting with this film. And he did appear in other Kurosawa films, but mostly in supporting roles, I think as early as Seven Samurai. And he's still with us too, actually. Tatsuya Nakadai is still alive, 92 years old.
Wow.
But yeah, Kurosawa, I think he found his footing later in life, particularly, when he was lionized around the world and celebrated. I don't think he was in want of recognition. I know that he had a lot of disappointments in his later career. I know he tried to mount. Oh my God, I would have loved to see this film. He tried to make Runaway Train, that was later made into the film in 1987 with Jon Voight.
Yeah.
And, the Russian director Andrei Konchalovsky, I'm mispronouncing his name, loved that film, but it was actually based on a screenplay that Kurosawa wrote, and he had.
Wow.
So yeah, it's stuff like that I'm like, oh, if only he had different, just resources where he could have made those kind of films. But unfortunately, that the era of that auteur had passed him by, I guess.
Yeah, it's bittersweet to read, that Kurosawa had an accident in the 90s. He slipped, he broke his spine, and he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair at that point. And his goal was to die while filming a movie. He never got to do that because he couldn't work. And me, I always wonder like how much was couldn't work and physically cannot do it, and how much is Hollywood just not or filmmaking not being a medium that encourages disabled filmmakers. So it definitely is sad to read about, and question whether Kurosawa was affected by the fact that we still have not moved the needle very far with wheelchair using directors. That's my soapbox for the day. But I mean, I know that we've only discussed two of these films this month. I've seen several. I don't think I've been disappointed by any of them so far. I still have quite a few to watch. Scott, I mean, where people who watch High and Low, where do they go from here in terms of the Kurosawa movies you recommend? What are some musts?
Oh golly, I will call out two that both of which I think I've mentioned before, but they're not often celebrated as being top-notch Kurosawa, but I do have a soft spot for The Bad Sleep Well. It's sort of a takeoff on Hamlet, but it's done in such a way that it was fresh, and I think it really helped Kurosawa broaden his appeal towards cinema goers. I mean, it was a very hard-edged tale set in contemporary Japan, but it tells this tale of revenge, and it's not a revenge tale a la Point Blank or something else of that matter. It's a lot slower, and it's a lot more interior looking, more cerebral. But that to me is a really good Kurosawa film. And the other one is Redbeard. And Redbeard to me, and then that was the last film that he made with Mifune in 65. Not a lot of people think very highly of this film. It's long. I think it's close to 3 hours. It's a departure from any other film that he had made with Mifune up to that point, but it's such a humane film about the impact that a doctor makes on feudal Japan at during the it was I can't remember what period it was set in, but it was set in the past. I think they call this as the Jedi Geki films. But Redbeard I have a soft spot for that. It's a very moving picture. Uh, and just to see the humanity on display uh, with this doctor who is constantly having to fight against bureaucracy and small town superstition and all sorts of other stripes that he has to work through just to care for people. It's a very moving film, and I highly recommend Redbeard for those who are, especially those who feel like they are somewhat initiated into the Kurosawa oeuvre. I hate that word, but yet here I am using it. I I would highly recommend that you see Redbeard. And I'm going to call out Criterion. They still haven't put out a Blu-ray of it of Redbeard, so get on that, my friends.
Yeah, The Bad Sleep Well is on Criterion. I have that on my to watch list. So I'm excited to see more, and I'm excited to see. I think we all agree Spike Lee redoing this and seeing what's gonna happen. Final thoughts on High and Low. I mean, I think I speak for everybody when I say we all loved it. I think it's definitely a different type of movie. It's remarkably nuanced. It's fascinating. I use that word a lot, I know. Mifune's great, and it's just a great little morality story, writ large, that just kept me emotionally invested for a long time. And also plays as both, I think, a fantasy of the way we would like rich people to be, and also is also about the reality of the way rich people can be. Emily, final thoughts?
Looking at it just from a crime fiction perspective, which it's just incredibly interesting, and I can't see a modern original crime movie getting away with essentially resolving the crime less than half of the way through the runtime of the movie. But it's incredibly compelling, and it's making me rethink narrative threads and how and the length of storytelling. It's someone who has to churn out 80,000 words per crime fiction novel, that seems very short, but to sustain tension and to sustain sort of unknowingness for that long, it takes a lot of work to hide the whodunit and to hide the resolution and to pile as much politics on to a narrative of crime without suffocating people with the politics of crime. And how this is done is extremely interesting. I think that the mistaken identity kidnap sort of plot line has been stolen from this a million times, and so that doesn't really work anymore. But but I'm really fascinated with how he was able to make us care so much about a person who committed a pretty heinous crime and keep him human throughout the entire narrative, even before we knew who he was. It's just really, really masterfully done. And it's something that I'm going to be thinking about quite a bit over the course of the next couple of years of working on more books.
Exactly. Scott, take us out. Final thoughts on High and Low.
My final thought, jumping off from what you said, Kristen, about the fantasy of a good, wealthy man. Well, it's also a fantasy of a wealthy man having to grapple with decisions and questions that have vast consequences. to their lives. And how often do the wealthy have to the super wealthy, the billionaires out there? How often do they grapple with the same issues that we are grappling with every fucking day? And that's the fantasy of High and Low that I find particularly engaging, and it also that's what brings me back. I will also say that for any would-be screenwriters or directors out there, you really should look at High and Low to find out to see how Kurosawa blocks and how as written the scenes of people just talking in a room are written and directed. That is it's a master class in learning how to do that. And I'm not a director, I'm not a filmmaker, but I do know that is a very difficult thing to figure out and to master and to do well. And so look at High and Low for some inspiration, guys.
I do want to mention, we didn't talk about this at the end, but to go off of that before we close it up, I love that at the end of the movie, Gondo is telling the kidnapper, oh, I lost my business, but don't worry, I'm working in another business. I'm making a lot less money, but I'm happy. I get to spend time with my kid and I get to do all these things. And I think that that's, again, another moment of fantasy where you're just like, so he still wins at the end. He still wins. He's just making a little less money, but he gets the ability to have everything at the end. I think, again, it's so smart. It's so interesting. I love how it just plays with the concept of wealth and class and just, ooh, layers, man, layers. If you have seen High and Low or Kurosawa, please let us know. You can always go old school and email them to us at I'm trying to remember what I'm doing right now. I have so many emails at ticklishbiz@gmail.com. You can also tweet them or send them to us on all social media. We're on Twitter at ticklish_biz and everywhere else at ticklishbiz. I would like to thank Scott McGee once again for taking time out of his awesome TCM life to come and chat with us. Scott, where are you online? Anything fans should know about coming up?
I'm on Blue Sky. You can find me there, john.scott.mcgee, Blue Sky. And so far as other appearances, I don't have anything coming up. I'll be at the Plaza Classic Film Festival in El Paso at the end of July, introducing films. But other than that, it's going to be a quiet summer.
And you have your book. You also are an author, so
I do have the book, Danger on the Silver Screen. I gotta tell you, I to be honest with you, I actually forgot we were talking about High and Low. I thought we were talking for some reason in my mind. I thought, oh, she must want to talk to me about my book because the Oscars are recognizing stunts. Maybe that's okay. Yeah.
I mean, I'll talk to you about anything
about stunts. Like,
oh shit, that's right. I do remember this now. High and Low. So I'm glad it worked out.
Yes.
Thank you for pointing that out. I do have a book. Yes.
But yeah, Scott's book is great. I have my copy, which I forgot to bring to I just forgot to give you the copy of my book to sign, a pin. I just ignored you the entire festival, Scott. I apologize for that. Next year, please consider buying his book as well as Emily and I's books. Book buying is important in this world, so please help us make a buck.
Danger on the Silver Screen is what it's called. Emily, what's your book?
I have a book series called, it starts with a book called Viviana Valentine Gets Her Man. It's a 1950s sort of screwball noir comedy, actually.
It's very fun. It's very fun to read. There's 3 of them. So yeah, that's going to close out this episode of Ticklish Business. As always, you can follow us on the internet in all its forms. I'm always on social at Kristen Lopez 88, and you can read all my movie reviews and thoughts on things at the Film Maven. That's the Film Maven, 2ms.substack.com. Emily Edwards, where are you on the internet? What do you got going on?
Oh, golly. Well, I am absolutely everywhere on social media at Ms. Emily Edwards. I would love it if you followed me over on Instagram because I just got my first "your social media footprint isn't big enough to get a book deal" rejection. So please follow someone who never posts anything over on Instagram at Ms. Emily Edwards. And you can find links to various things at MsEmilyEdwards.com.
You posted that darling cat video the other day that I showed 3 people. So you post things. Come
To
on.
all my animals.
And you can always listen to our episodes going all the way back to episode 1. Not that I advocate for that because, oof, those were rough. But our archive is always free at ticklishbusiness.podbean.com. And if you really, really Sally Field level like us, then please consider supporting us via Patreon. It keeps the lights on at Ticklish Biz HQ and allows us to do fun things like motivating us to get back into a bi-weekly schedule, which is what is happening. Yay! And we hope to get back to doing all sorts of bonus content, including our bonus shows that are available on Patreon based on a true podcast and doubled features. We also give out all sorts of fun swag throughout the year. So consider joining just $1, less than the price of a cup of coffee or eggs or whatever
Cup of
you
coffee in 1987.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I don't really know what you can buy for $1 these days. I mean, even the 99-cent store, I think, is inflated.
Gumballs are 50 cents now.
Oh,
Gumballs.
but check us out, patreon.com/ticklishbiz. We would like to always thank our patrons, including Allie Moore, Danny, David Floyd, Gates, Mick F., Rachel Clark, Shawn Goodreau. I will switch that list up at some point, I promise. Thank you to everybody who continues to support the show. We will be back soon because it's going to be the 4th of July. And you know what that means, Emily. We can't go back into the water because we're going to need a bigger boat because we are talking about 1975's Jaws. Yes, it took 8 years for us to do an episode about Jaws, but it is happening, and it is happening in our next episode. Until then.